Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Take a careful look at this image. It's a composite from the outside of the crime scene. And Brian's face, which is in turn a composite as well. And I know it's just images, but do you see how his face eventually becomes the tree outside the funhouse, and the tree eventually becomes his face? Through this metaphorical image, I'm trying to ask a question. How did he become who he was? How do we become who we are? If we have an injury right now, does that define us? If we have an injury right now or sickness, what defines how we respond to that? What are the main agents that make us who we are? And so by looking at this case, we're trying to figure out Brian Kohberger. We sort of also figure out ourselves. We also figure out how we have come to be who we are. And maybe we need to untangle ourselves, right? So think about it. When do the trees make us into what we are? Or do the woods do that? Think about it. Environment, circumstance, society. Surely these play a role. Attitudes, beliefs, incidents. Surely these set up some sort of governing psychology. When Brian was a security guard, he was used to being part of the woodwork, as it were, loitering, looking at the surfaces of buildings, looking at human traffic, but from the perspective of a spectator, from someone being on the outside, right? And supposedly as a sort of protector and policeman. And so I think, was it so strange for security guard Brian to look at the funhouse, to be in that same sort of situation where he's used to that whole thing of lurking and loitering, of sitting in a car watching, of driving by, whiling away time while preoccupied with his own thoughts, of being on the outside, of being a peeping Tom, always on the outside looking in. The only difference was 28-year-old Brian was supposed to be above and beyond that. So why wasn't he? What is the source of all suffering? How do we define happiness versus unhappiness? You may have noticed in the number 10 clue we all missed, I glossed over this particular point from the Daily Beast. Former friends told the Daily Beast that Kohberger's high school years were marked by drastic weight loss, as well as cruel bullying. Not just ordinary bullying, cruel bullying. Not just ordinary weight loss, drastic weight loss. Meanwhile, his parents battled serious financial issues, not just financial issues, serious financial issues. Filing for bankruptcy twice. When Kohberger was born, like Elvis, he was born into this situation of deprivation, insufficiency, not having enough. And then again, at that crucial age, when he was 14, when a person needs to expand, needs to increase themselves, needs to become something, there was this second hobbling bankruptcy. On that second occasion, his family surrendered their house. They lost their house. They lost their car. They faced over $250,000 in debt and just had $512 in the bank. And in that situation, someone becomes a heroin addict. And your parents don't even have a car, or do they? They don't even have a car. So how do you get from one place to another? Do you go on a bicycle? Do you walk? So when I put some of these details into the heading, some people thought the number 10 clue was that Brian grew up poor. No, the number 10 clue was that he was fat and that was a bum deal growing up. Poverty, that is clue number 11. But what does it mean? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying the content on this channel, you can also follow me on Twitter at Crime Rocket or on Patreon at patreon.com/TCRS. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And let's get started. So what is the source, if you're talking about poverty, and if we're looking at poverty as the clue that we all missed, the 11th clue that we've all missed, what does it actually mean? What does poverty mean in terms of the human experience? What does it mean at a ground roots level, and what does it mean in a symbolic sense? How does society perceive you if you're poor compared to someone else who isn't? And how do you perceive yourself? How do you perceive the world where people around you have more than you have? People struggle less than you do. People have it easier than you do. You are in the shade, they're in the sunshine. And so I think one's got to ask the question, where does this sort of thing come from? Where does poverty come from? Also, what is the source of all suffering? Whether you're a man or an insect, not having enough of something is suffering. It might not be enough food, might not be enough shelter, it might not be enough love from the people around you. It may not be enough feeling valued by people around you. It may not be enough sex. Ask Ernest Becker and he'll tell you that man is unique in the sense that he is a symbolic animal and he feeds himself mostly on self-esteem. And so you can be poor in the sense that your self-esteem is impoverished. And so the question is, if you are actually poor, could that affect your esteem? Could that affect the esteem others have of you? Could that affect your sense of your own esteem? And could that affect your sense of how others esteem you? So what do you think poverty, again, can do in that sort of equation? Do you think it can have a lasting impact? If bullying can have a lasting impact, can poverty? If we're talking about esteem, now think about it, if you don't have that much esteem to begin with as a fat person and then your family sort of fall into poverty, aren't you talking about a double blow in terms of esteem? If we're talking about esteem, status, self-worth, what does poverty do to those constructs? If you arrive at school with second-hand shoes or second-hand clothing or second-hand bag or pencils that your brother or sister or somebody else, a relative, used, how do other people around you relate to that? Maybe you can't afford to do certain sports. Let me put it in a different way. If you're poor, if you grew up poor and you lacked agency your whole life, but I mean from the perspective of a young person, how else could you prove your worth? If you didn't have resources, other than showing how smart you were, what else would you have to work with? You can't use physical things because the very nature of poverty is that you lack physical resources. So for anyone mired in poverty, their highest achievement, their most affirming accomplishment has to be that they figured their way out of their circumstances. Like Oprah did. Hard work, yes, but also the intellectual power and resilience, the verve to outwit the circumstances one was born into. You know, it's like the game of Survivor, outwit, outplay, outlast. And so what do you really respect about that? A lot of it is the wit, the intelligence. And imagine if your parents are blue-collar folk and you manage to leave that world behind. You manage to make something of yourself. You manage to sort of win your own personal game of survivor. Now let's come back to the question, how do we define happiness versus unhappiness? If you recognize that music, you probably know what I'm angling at. In the brilliant series, The White Lotus, that's season 1 and 2, we see different people, very, very different people, in the exact same setting, a hotel on holiday, and yet the experiences are so vastly different. The experiences in the same place are so varying. Why? And so you can take that to a university setting or to Frederick, Colorado, right? Or to Boulder, Colorado. Why? Why are people's experiences so vastly different? in terms of the White Lotus, some are on a holiday they can afford. Some are on just another holiday. Some are on a holiday from themselves. Some aren't on holiday at all because they can't stop working, or can't afford to stop working, or can't switch off. And so the thing that makes us unhappy is poverty, either real or perceived, or a mixture of both. In Brian Koberger's case, I wager that his poverty was both real and perceived. Real and perceived by him when it was actually happening, and real and perceived by others when he thought it was in the past. There's also the poverty that comes from being an outcast. I mean, think about that in Survivor as well, where you have all the money in the world, or you've pulled yourself out of whatever situation. You've educated yourself, transformed yourself, made something of yourself, and you know you have, except the world still sees you as that fat person, as who you were and where you were. One may imagine that not having enough money equates to poverty, but what's the difference between the financial situation of the Watts family and the Kobergers? That's on the one hand, and the Murdars on the other. So not enough is to some extent a particular point of view, a cultural attitude in a sense. Still, it's not enough money that is at issue here. You can't say someone who's poor is going to become a criminal. But not having enough money is where that road leads. It's where that road leads and where that road starts. And where is that? Esteem. I would imagine if Koberger's family didn't have serious financial issues during the first 14 years of his life, including the first bankruptcy when he was born, I doubt whether he would have had the serious esteem issues he ultimately inherited. Not esteem issues, serious esteem issues. Serious financial issues, serious esteem issues. And he inherited these, he was born into them. And he tried to transcend them, he tried to get above them and beyond them. The same applies with Watts and Murdoch. If you could somehow magic away the financial strain, I think the crime itself would likely also fall away. If Watts could afford to get divorced, he would have gotten divorced. And yet the financial strain persists in all of these stories. Why is that the case? And that's why I think the issue isn't actually the financial strain. It is driven by esteem issues that pre-exist to those financial choices. It's esteem issues that actually drive those financial choices that lead to poverty. Do you believe that? We think it's just bad luck that you end up in poverty and then you go bankrupt again. All right? Vincent van Gogh is a good example of someone who found himself trapped in society's impression of him. And although he is poor, he himself was tremendously rich in terms of a meaningful existence, in terms of a mission that he had for his own life. I know a bit about him. I've written a book about him. I've followed in his footsteps in France and in the Netherlands. And so he actually transcended his own poverty because he chose not to apply the same standard the world applied in terms of material wealth to the wealth of existence and experience and of being. This is why it's a tremendous disservice to the man and the myth of Vincent van Gogh to pretend that Van Gogh, who was so invigorated by life, especially in the summer of 1890, when he was at his most prolific, to twist him instead into a suicidal struggler, when his art was actually rescuing and restoring him back to health. And so even in death, Van Gogh is trapped in society's impression of him. His art is worth a fortune today, regardless of whether we see Van Gogh as a depressed lunatic or anything else, which I think says something about impressions of both the living and the dead in general, wouldn't you say? If Koberger could have found a way to be Van Gogh, to have developed an independent sense of his own esteem, and also to have developed to some extent a knack for being alone, and for doing something constructive with his alone time, he may have emerged on the other side richer and functional and found his way ultimately. But the fact is, the world has a very shallow view of success and happiness, of us. this idea that you have to be obviously and outwardly beautiful and successful in order to be easily accepted. And if one accepts the superficial standard, well, then you live by that sword, and you also die by that sword. And in a way, the White Lotus tests some of these impressions that are so common in society, in social settings. So what is the antidote to this? Stop coveting what you see every day. Accept yourself, be yourself, and learn to enjoy who you are, just as you are, and if needs be, improve yourself. But improve yourself for you, not for them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.